Bienvenue dans Décryptage sur Africa 24. Le Réseau mondial contre les crises alimentaires a rendu public l'édition 2023 de son rapport sur les crises alimentaires dans le monde. Dans ce rapport, l'on apprend que les conflits, les chocs économiques, les conditions météorologiques extrêmes ont été à l'origine d'une insécurité alimentaire aiguë, touchant plus de 258 millions de personnes à travers 58 pays dans le monde. Pour aborder les données de ce rapport en ce qui concerne l'Afrique, nous recevons aujourd'hui Hugh MACLEMAN, responsable de l'engagement des pays au Réseau mondial contre les crises alimentaires, une institution du programme alimentaire mondial. Hugh MACLEMAN, bienvenue sur Africa 24. Sur les 42 pays du monde dans lesquels des crises alimentaires majeures ont été recensées en 2022, 26 sont sur le continent africain avec plus de 48 millions de personnes en situation de crise alimentaire et aiguë, selon l'édition 2023 du rapport mondial sur les crises alimentaires. Qu'est-ce qui explique cette mauvaise performance pour l'Afrique?
Yeah, unfortunately, the situation is actually even worse than that. We've seen an increase in the number of people facing severe food insecurity globally of 48 million this year. But the total number of people facing crisis levels of food insecurity is about 258 million people in 58 countries. And really a quarter of the way into the 21st century, this is pretty indefensible. In Africa, this includes 145.7 million people, more than 20% of people in 36 countries affected by food crises who have crisis levels of hunger. We're also seeing risk of famine in parts of Somalia, South Sudan, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Nigeria. So it's a pretty bleak picture, but I think that's one where there are solutions.
Dans ce rapport, le 7e du genre, quelles sont les grandes tendances pour les régions de l'Afrique?
Well, alarmingly, the trend is getting worse. The first report we published was in 2017, and it showed that there were 108 million people facing an acute food crisis globally. So the number of people has more than doubled in less than a decade. Now, partly that's because we have a better understanding today of food crises. We have better data for more countries, but it's also because the risks that drive food insecurity are accelerating, and namely conflict, climate change, and economic fragility. And for regions in Africa, this is particularly the case. East, West, Central, and Southern Africa are disproportionately exposed to the impacts of climate change, as can be seen in East Africa, where we've seen an unprecedented 6 failed rainy seasons. The global report also shows that economic drivers of hunger are having a more severe impact in Africa. The combined longer-term impacts of COVID-19, along with the war in Ukraine, have led to an unprecedented rise in the cost of food, but it's also disrupted supply chains, including vital seeds and fertilizers, and it's increased the debt burden of countries in Africa, so they're less able to manage and address these impacts. But the major driver of food crises remains conflict, and conflicts across Africa are getting more frequent and they're lasting for longer. Food aid can't solve conflict, and if we really want to reverse the trend of growing food insecurity, we need to stop wars.
L'insécurité alimentaire qui tenaille les pays africains relève du paradoxe quand on sait que ce continent abrite à lui seul 65% des terres arables non cultivées du monde. Comment réparer cette situation?
Well, as you say, the African continent of such massive potential, the innovation, the energy of young African people, the massive natural wealth, they need to be at the heart of reversing this trend. And really, this will require a whole of society approach. So it needs to be led by countries and people themselves, and ensure that governments prioritize reversing this trend, that the private sector steps up, and that people and communities themselves have the resources to be more resilient to these drivers of the crises. And of course, it needs to be supported by the international community to ensure that there's appropriate financing, including climate financing, that's available at the right time. And some of the structural imbalances that drive these crises around trade need to be addressed. And this needs to be done in the spirit of solidarity to ensure that where people are in need, vital assistance is available to them.
À combien estimez-vous les fonds nécessaires à allouer à l'Afrique annuellement pour soutenir les efforts mis en œuvre pour lutter contre l'insécurité alimentaire?
Well, in many ways, I think it's maybe the wrong question. I think the answer to addressing food insecurity is ensuring that the food systems that help to feed people are strong and resilient and adaptable. And this includes elements like strengthening value chains in Africa or ensuring that agricultural inputs are available at the right time. Things like reducing post-harvest losses and improving interregional trade. So It's these longer term efforts and these structural policy changes that I think are really going to make a difference. In terms of international aid, it's at an all-time high. It's 204 billion per year, but it's never going to be enough to meet these needs. We need to make sure that the right sort of financing is in the right place at the right time for the right things. And this, of course, includes aid, but it also includes ensuring that national budgets are actually focused on strengthening agriculture and food systems, that the private sector is playing its part, that remittances and foreign direct investment are really harnessed to prevent and reverse this growing trend of food insecurity.
Votre rapport est surtout un plaidoyer à l'endroit des acteurs humanitaires, mais aussi des gouvernements, afin qu'ils améliorent leurs interventions et politiques. Comment évaluez-vous l'impact de cette publication en Afrique depuis le premier rapport? Vous en êtes au 7e actuellement.
Yes, I think the global report has become a really vital global public good that helps to really shine a light on both the drivers of food crises and the impacts of food crises on people. And food crises are complex. They're driven by a wide range of interconnected and interreacting risks. And I think the global report is really important to help us understand those risks better. Because if we hope to address and prevent food crises, we need that common understanding of where those risks are, where they're having an impact, and who they're impacting upon. So having this shared analysis is really at the heart of working better together to improve the effectiveness of what we do in preventing and managing food crises. Because we can't solve it with any one actor. We need to work much more closely together. And the global network also brings together actors to act on this, not just to analyze it, but to ensure that we're addressing crises early and we're addressing them in a more coordinated way.
Après quelques jours de suspension de vos activités au Soudan suite à l'assassinat de 3 travailleurs humanitaires, vous avez repris du service dans ce pays plongé dans l'instabilité. Quels sont les grands axes de l'intervention du PAM au Soudan?
Yeah, the situation in Sudan is complex and evolving rapidly. WFP has resumed its work in Sudan, and our immediate focus is on the most vulnerable people. And what I mean by that is we've started life-saving operations in Sudan to meet the immediate needs of those who are most vulnerable to what's going on, and that's refugees, host communities, internally displaced people. We're really scaling up our efforts in Gaddaraf, in Gezira, Kassala, and White Nile states. And I think in the next couple of days, we hope to reach about 380,000 people. We currently have about 8,000 metric tons of food in place in Sudan, and we expect another 33,000 metric tons to arrive in Port Sudan in the next few days. But we really need help to make sure that we're effective in Sudan, and we need 3 things. We need to make sure that we have safe and unhindered access to people who need our help. We need all parties to respect international humanitarian law. Really, the killing of humanitarian staff and the destruction of humanitarian assets and is unacceptable and is illegal under international law. WFP has had trucks and planes who have been in the line of fire, and we've also had almost 17,000 metric tons of food that's been looted from our warehouses, and this needs to stop. But really, for us to do our job, we also need funding. And even before the current crisis, we had a funding gap of around $300 million, and that's expected to rise quite significantly with the current events.
La crise du Covid, la guerre en Ukraine, la dépréciation des monnaies par rapport au dollar, les changements climatiques sont quelques-uns des facteurs qui causent la situation alarmante de la crise sanitaire de l'Afrique. Toutefois, le PAM projette-t-il d'ajuster sa stratégie sur le continent pour répondre plus efficacement aux urgences?
Yeah, WFP remains committed to working with partners across Africa with vital humanitarian assistance that's needed. And we're the largest humanitarian agency globally. We reach around 156 million people a year in over 120 countries. But for WFP, it's not just about saving lives, it's also about changing lives. And we need to continue to work to reduce the drivers of these crises in the first place. We can't just keep responding with emergency assistance. And this includes working with others and investing in things like resilient shock responsive food systems and supporting vulnerable communities over the longer term to build their resilience to these sorts of shocks. This is things like shock responsive social protection schemes that we're working with government on. It's land regeneration, and it's these longer term efforts that are really going to make the difference, I think, in the African context. And this is working. We saw this year or last year in Niger, for instance, in 2022, the country faced it's really one of its worst food crises in over a decade. But because of the longer term efforts that WFP and others have been investing in Niger, people had resilience to this crisis. And even though they were facing quite an acute food crisis, we prevented 500,000 people from having to draw on emergency humanitarian assistance.
Hugh MACLEMAN, responsable de l'engagement des pays au réseau mondial contre les crises alimentaires, merci d'avoir répondu aux questions d'Africa 24. Merci aussi à vous de nous avoir suivis et à très bientôt pour une autre édition de Décryptage sur Africa 24.